Boa tarde a todas e todos. É um prazer estar aqui hoje à tarde com vocês, né, para que a gente possa escutar aqui o seminário que vai nos dar o professor Randall Wray e conversar com ele sobre esses temas. Esse, então, é o terceiro evento do ciclo de seminários As Várias Faces da Crise, Políticas, Economia e Violências. Esse ciclo é organizado pelo Grupo de Estudos Neoliberalismo, Subjetivação e Resistências, é um grupo de estudos do IEA USP, um grupo de estudos do qual eu faço parte, e esse nosso evento de hoje é um evento, digamos, mais ligado às violências do ponto de vista da economia, e, em certo sentido, ele dá sequência a uma discussão que nós tivemos um outro evento aqui no IEA na semana passada, discutindo moeda e gasto público, reflexões em tempos de pandemia e após, tá? Hoje nós temos o prazer de receber aqui o professor Randall Wray, que hoje é professor do Levy Economics Institute no Bard College, Nova York, enfim, né, com uma longa carreira acadêmica, tendo passado aí muito tempo na Universidade de Missouri, Kansas City. O professor Randall Wray é internacionalmente reconhecido como um dos grandes formuladores da chamada Teoria Monetária Moderna, MMT em inglês, e o professor Randall Wray vai nos falar hoje um pouco sobre como é que nós podemos enfrentar os desafios da Covid-19, né, facing the challenges of COVID-19, e por que a gente não deve almejar voltar a uma normalidade, né? Então, nessa fala de hoje, o professor Randall Wray vai passar aí por alguns pontos centrais da teoria monetária moderna, né? Vai discutir um pouco o espaço que a teoria monetária moderna vem ganhando aí no debate político-econômico nos últimos meses, né, em todo o mundo, em função aí das questões muito prementes colocadas pela pandemia, né, e da pressão que isso coloca sobre os estados, a necessidade de realizar gastos públicos, mas tem aí uma preocupação também, né, de por que isso não deve ser apenas uma medida temporária, ou essas políticas não devem ser apenas políticas temporárias, né, porque essas políticas de austeridade, elas são muito danosas para a economia, tá? Então, para os que estão nos assistindo, é possível fazer perguntas, né, que serão encaminhadas aqui ao professor Wray, eu farei esse encaminhamento, né, essas perguntas, para quem entrou aí pelo site do IEA USP, há, enfim, instruções aí a serem seguidas, né, um linkzinho onde vocês devem clicar para que possam enviar essas perguntas. Enfim, podem ser enviadas em português ou em inglês, e a gente, enfim, né, coloca elas aqui para discussão, tá? O debate, o seminário, na verdade, né, vai ser feito em inglês. Eu vou passar a palavra aqui imediatamente para o professor Randall Wray, e é isso, né, desejo aqui que nós tenhamos todos um bom seminário. So, Professor Wray, I think we are ready to start. So, again, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. I think your topics is going to be of much interest for we all that are here in Brazil and living a very difficult situation because of COVID-19 and everything. So, again, thank you for accepting our invitation. Okay, now it's you.
Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation. I am going to give a very informal presentation, and I'll leave a lot of time for questions from Simone, from the audience, if that's possible. And I jotted down a few of the very common questions I always get. So after giving a brief introduction, I will answer a few of those questions. And I'll try to remember to speak slowly. No PowerPoints, no data, no models. I'm going to first just do an introduction to what is MMT, and then move on to all of the publicity MMT has gotten in the past few months, and talk a bit about moving forward, how MMT will be useful as we deal with the pandemic, but also a lot of other economic and social problems that the pandemic has exposed. Serious problems with the economic model. I mean, the economies that we're all living in, the pandemic has exposed serious problems with them. So I'll talk a bit about that too. So first, what is MMT? Modern money theory. It provides an analysis of fiscal and monetary policy that's applicable to governments that issue their own sovereign currency. And so let me define what I mean by sovereign currency. There are 4 basic requirements. The national government chooses a money of account. So in the United States, it's the dollar, RMB in China, and so on. So it's the national government that chooses the money of account. And it's very typical from the very origins of a nation that the government chooses a new money of account. When colonies separate from the colonizers, they choose a currency. That's exactly what the United States did. When we had a revolution against Britain, we, of course, did not continue to use the British pound. We chose the US dollar, and that was to thumb our noses at the British because we adopted a currency based on the Spanish currency, not the British currency. Okay, so you choose your own money of account. Second, you impose obligations in your money of account. So the national government imposes obligations that the subjects, if it's a monarchy, or citizens, if it's a democracy, have to meet. Today, the main obligation that's imposed is taxes. For the past 200 years, taxes have become increasingly important as the main obligation that the government imposes. If you go back further in time, it would have been fees, fines, tribute in the case of conquerors, or tithes in the case of religious authorities. So they denominate these obligations that must be paid in the money of account. Third, the government issues a currency denominated in that same money of account, and it accepts its currency in payment of those obligations it has imposed. In the past, governments sometimes would take foreign currency in payments. In the United States, we did that until about the mid-19th century. You could pay your taxes in US dollars, or the federal government would take foreign currencies in some cases. Generally, today, modern, more or less rich developed countries only accept their own currencies in payment of taxes. And fourth, if the national government issues other obligations, such as bills or bonds that pay interest, that are generally longer maturity, they make those also payable in the government's own currency. So they denominate it in their own money of account, and they promise to make payments in their own currency. Now, there are deviations from this, especially among Latin American countries that will denominate debt in US dollars. The rich developed countries do not do that. And we can come back to that because I think that it is probably always a mistake for a government to issue debt in a foreign currency. Okay, there's a fifth consideration that follows from these. If a country pegs its currency to a foreign currency, so if you dollarize a Latin American country that dollarizes, or if you adopt a gold standard, then you don't really have a sovereign currency. And the reason is because you are promising to deliver whatever you have pegged to. So if you have pegged to the US dollar, effectively all of your obligations, the national government's obligations, are payable in US dollars. So countries that peg do not have a sovereign currency by the definition that MMT is using. And that can make a difference. It can reduce your domestic policy space. You may have to operate your economy in a way that keeps that foreign currency flowing in or keeps gold flowing in if you're on a gold standard. And that means you give up substantial policy space. Now, this is something I can talk about more later if you want me to. People often claim that modern money theory completely ignores countries that peg and argue every country needs to float their currency. That's an exaggeration. We don't ignore them, but we do recognize that you give up policy space. For some countries, it may be worthwhile to do this. So we're not recommending that everyone immediately float their currency. But floating your currency does increase domestic policy space. Okay, and finally, the normal case has been for countries to issue their own sovereign currency and to meet those four conditions around the world and as far back as we go in time. This has been fairly normal. And today, all the rich developed capitalist countries do issue their own sovereign currencies with one major exception, and that is the euro area. These countries all had their own national currencies, and they gave them up when they joined the euro. We began warning in the mid-90s that this was going to be a big mistake and lead to serious problems that I think we have seen. Okay, now what difference does it make for a country to have its own sovereign currency? So we argue that a sovereign currency issuer, first, does not face a budget constraint as that is normally defined. So the usual orthodox, mainstream macroeconomists argue that governments are just like households. They face a budget constraint. They're constrained by their tax revenue, by their ability to borrow, and as a last resort that should almost never be done, printing money. That's the only thing they can do that households can't do. Tax revenue is supposed to be the best way to finance your spending. And borrowing can lead to problems, including insolvency. And printing money is terrible because it's going to cause inflation and probably hyperinflation. So you should really never do that one. In our view, all of this is completely wrong-headed, completely mistaken. Sovereign governments do not face a budget constraint. They are not constrained in any way by tax revenue. They do not need to borrow at all. And in fact, borrowing in your own currency when you're the currency issuer is a completely senseless operation. You really can't borrow your own currency. And finally, printing money. I'll say more about that all governments today spend by crediting bank accounts. The spending is simultaneous with the financing of the spending, and it's all done today with keystrokes. Second, a sovereign government can never run out of money. If they are issuing a sovereign currency, they can never run out. Now, don't misinterpret this as saying that they ought to spend without any limit at all. Governments impose on themselves budgets, and they spend up to the authorized amount. This is a good idea. So we're not recommending that they just start spending without any limit at all, but they cannot run out of the money needed to finance the spending. Third, they can always meet their obligations by paying in their own currency. And today that is always keystrokes. Now that would not be true for a country that is on a gold standard or that has pegged to the US dollar and dollarized. They can run out of the foreign currency and gold, and that can create a big problem for them. And finally, they can set the interest rate on any obligations that they issue. They are not subject to market forces determining the interest rate they pay on their debt. They can set the interest rate that they pay. Now, let me talk a bit about the developments over the past about 5.5 months. Go back 5.5 months ago, MMT was in the news. I think every central banker in the world weighed in on MMT. Many politicians weighed in on it. Last summer, a bunch of Republicans in the House actually got together and tried to pass a resolution condemning MMT as being a danger to the United States. So we had all of these people, all the central bankers, including the head of the Fed, the head of the Bank of Japan, all were interviewed about MMT. And they all announced it was crazy, it was dangerous, they would never do it, they would never follow MMT proposals. 2 months later, the coronavirus hit. The pandemic spread around the world. And the exact same people immediately said, we're going to use MMT now. So when the crisis hit, they all said, we're going to follow MMT. We're going to start just printing up money. In the United States, they started sending out checks to all Americans. But that was a very small part of what they're doing. Trillions of dollars are being created to deal with the pandemic. The Treasury is spending, and the Fed is lending and also buying up assets, going way beyond what they did in the global financial crisis that began in 2007, 2008. We've already done far more just a couple months later than we did in the global financial crisis in terms of Fed and Treasury spending and lending. So now if they're interviewed, they say, well, of course we're using MMT. We have to, okay? We're in a crisis. And in a crisis, you have to go ahead and spend trillions, spend without limit, because we have to save the economy. They use the analogy that comes from Milton Friedman of helicopter money. So we're running the printing presses, we're flying the helicopters around, and we're flooding the economy with dollars. So that's the United States. But all the other central banks and treasuries of the rich countries are doing the same thing. So from our perspective, the whole thing's been hilarious. because they switched from extremely dangerous, we would never do that, to embracing it and calling it helicopter money. Now, in fact, we have never advocated helicopter money. We have never said that central banks should fly helicopters and drop bags of money into people's backyards. We don't even support sending out checks to all Americans. We don't see this as a proper response at all. What we've been arguing is that governments can't run out of money, that they don't face a budget constraint, and that the budgets have been consistently, persistently too tight in all of the developed world. And our economies have operated far below capacity, with far too much unemployment, with far too much poverty, persistently, really since the early 1970s, when this fear of deficits gripped the policymakers all over the world. And so I can say more about that later. The rise of neoliberalism and the view that governments ought to be balancing their budgets. So we've never supported pumping trillions of dollars into the economy. We never supported quantitative easing back in the global financial crisis. We don't support quantitative easing now. We never argued that the Fed should just print up money to pay for fiscal stimulus programs. We never argued that MMT is something you use in a crisis. We see MMT as mostly a description of the way that modern governments actually spend and the way a sovereign currency operates. So while we're really glad MMT is in the news, and we're glad that it's being embraced, even if they don't really understand what it is, we're glad that they're using it as a justification for ramping up the stimulus. But this isn't really the response we've been calling for, response to the pandemic. What we actually say is that the current procedures in place in the United States, in Japan, in Britain, in China, and in Brazil, that have been adopted by the Treasury, by the central bank, and by private banks, already allow the governments to spend up to the budget that's approved by the Congress or the Parliament, whatever form of governance that you have. And in the US case, signed by the president. They already had the procedures to do that. You don't need any special procedures to deal with either the global financial crisis or this current economic and health crisis. No change of procedures is required. You didn't need to suddenly adopt MMT in order to deal with the crisis. There is no money printing going on. There really aren't any helicopter drops. So what we emphasize is that there is no budget constraint. Whatever budget is passed can be met with normal spending procedures easily. What we emphasize is that sovereign governments face resource constraints, not financial constraints. If you have any unemployed resources, a sovereign government can always put those to use. And so in the global financial crisis, and in fact, all the way up to when the coronavirus hit the United States, we had substantial unused resources that we could have put to work. We've always argued that too much spending, whether it's by the government or by the private sector, can be inflationary. This isn't a matter of money causing inflation. It's a matter of spending beyond your resource constraints that can cause inflation. Continuing to describe MMT, and I'll come back to pandemic and crisis response. Before we documented how government really spends, beginning in the mid-90s, no academic economists really had any idea how sovereign governments spend. Now it drives our critics crazy when we explain in detail how government spend. They say, oh, you're getting me all confused about all this balance sheet stuff. And they say MMT is trying to obscure everything by explaining the minute details of how government spend. In the old days, it was very simple. When a government wanted to spend, it would print up currency or stamp coins. Or in medieval Europe, they would cut tally sticks and they would spin those into existence. They would collect them back in payments to the government, largely fees, fines, and then later taxes. And then they would always burn all of their revenue. When the tally sticks come back in payment of taxes, they're burned. When the paper money comes back to the government in payment of taxes, it's burned. When the coins come back, they're melted down and new coins are made. Maybe new denominations, maybe new pictures on the coins. Governments have never spent. So tax revenue is not for spending purposes. The tax is to ensure there's a demand for the currency, and receiving the currency back and then burning it is to prevent inflation. You take that currency out, you reduce demand in order to prevent inflation. Today, all modern governments spend through credits to bank accounts. When the Treasury spends, the central bank will credit the reserves of the recipient's bank, and the bank will credit the deposits of the recipient of the government spending. That is how government spending occurs. It's not from printing money anymore. It's just from a keystroke credit to a bank balance sheet. Taxes just reverse that. So taxes lead to a deduction to the taxpayer's bank account and a deduction to the reserves of the taxpayer's bank. Just keystrokes. If the government credits more bank accounts than it debits, then we call that a budget deficit. It doesn't need any special kind of financing because it has already occurred through the keystroke credits. And if the government spends more than it taxes, there have been net credits received in the private banking system. So it's electronic keystrokes today, and governments cannot run out. The central bank can never say no to the Treasury's request that they credit bank reserves so that banks can credit the deposit accounts of the recipients. From their perspective, they're never violating the typical prohibition against lending directly to the Treasury when the central bank makes payments for the Treasury. What they're doing is ensuring that the payment system functions smoothly. And that is the most important thing for central banks. Make sure the payment system functions smoothly and the Treasury checks never bounce. Furthermore, the sovereign government never really borrows its own money. Now, it could borrow foreign currency. You can issue debt in foreign currency. And we can think of that as a borrowing operation. But the sovereign government doesn't borrow its own money, which would be nonsensical. The government just spends by crediting bank accounts. It doesn't need to borrow anything in order to do that. They do sell bonds, and way back in, I think that it was January of 1996, Warren Mosler, who is hedge fund manager, came on to the post-Keynesian thought discussion group, one of these very early discussion groups online, And he said, you know, bond sales are just a reserve drain. And it took a few minutes for me to work through the balance sheets in my mind. Said, you know, Warren is right. If the Treasury sells bonds, the banks are going to lose reserves, because effectively banks use their reserves to buy bonds. It's exactly the same as when the central bank sells bonds. Now, everybody knew when central banks sell Treasury bonds, we call that an open market sale, and the purpose is to remove reserves from the banking system. It's in every money and banking textbook. Everybody knows that, not controversial. And Warren, who is a bond market guy, was thinking, you know, it's exactly the same when the Treasury sells bonds. It's just a reserve drain. It's not a borrowing operation at all. Why do we call that one a borrowing operation and say it's part of fiscal policy? But when the central bank does exactly the same thing, it sells bonds, we call that a monetary policy operation that is used to remove reserves from the system so that the central bank can hit the interest rate target. So Warren understood that it's not a borrowing operation at all. And so when you work through the balance sheets, and I hope some people will be inspired to do this at home, go through the balance sheets, you will see that Warren was absolutely right. It's not a borrowing operation at all. It just replaces reserves that are held by banks with bonds that are held by banks. And the reason that banks always want to do this is because they get higher interest rate on bonds than they get on reserves. So everybody's worried, oh, eventually the bond markets won't take any more government bonds. So the US is approaching a 100% debt ratio. The deficit is, who knows, on its way to 20% of GDP. We'll see. And people are worried, you know, maybe the bond markets won't take all that debt. Well, the answer is, of course they will, because the banks will be happy to hold more bonds and earn more interest than they get from interest on reserves. So there's no chance that the Treasury is going to offer bonds and find no takers. And this is also true for Brazil, by the way. See, everything I just said applies to Brazil. The selling the bonds commits the government to paying interest on those bonds. How do they pay interest? The same way they make any other payment. It's keystrokes. They can always pay the interest. And finally, the interest rate is determined by policy. It's not determined by bond vigilantes. Now, I know Brazil typically has much higher interest rates than the United States does, but that's a policy decision. It has nothing to do with bond vigilantes. It's largely the central bank that is keeping interest rates up. And at any time, the central bank can lower the interest rate target, and those interest rates will come down. Paying high interest is not a very efficient way for the government to spend. It tends to go to the wrong people, higher income people. It tends to go to foreigners, because foreigners hold a lot of bonds. In the case of the US, almost half of the bonds are held abroad. And so you're stimulating spending abroad. That may not be what you want to do. Okay, let me finish up with just a few remarks on the coronavirus and on the typical questions we always get. Before this crisis hit, the last big project that I'd been working on was the Green New Deal. So over the past year, we've been applying MMT principles to analyzing the Green New Deal and how are you going to pay for the Green New Deal. So in the United States, we had estimates that ranged up to a cost of $93 trillion for the Green New Deal. And when you hear a big number like that, I mean, the purpose of a big number like that is to scare people. 93 trillion. Where will the government ever find $93 trillion? How can taxpayers possibly afford taxes at such a level to raise 93 trillion when our GDP is only 20-something trillion? Okay. And so what Yeva Narcissian and I did was we went back to John Maynard Keynes, who wrote a short book, How to Pay for the War, in 1940. So Britain knew that World War II was going to be extremely costly in the same way that we know the Green New Deal is going to be costly in terms of dollars. And so Keynes looked at how are we going to pay for it and how are we going to avoid inflation this time? Because in World War I, which also had been expensive, lots of spending, and also high inflation during the war. And so he said that the problem is not paying for it, okay? The government can always pay for it. Back in those days, they actually printed up money. The problem is resources, because we will move from a time of slack resources. Remember, we're in the Great Depression. A time of slack where we have lots of excess resources that are not being utilized, to a time of more than full use of resources. We're going to go beyond full employment of all of our resource capacity. So how can we prevent inflation? What we have to do is reduce the private sector's demand so that will release resources to be used for the war effort. We're going to have to shift resources from private use to the government's use. And we're going to be beyond full employment, so everybody's going to be working. They're all going to be getting wages. So potentially, they could spend and compete with the government spending, and that would drive up inflation. So what we have to do is reduce private sector demand. And so, yes, we're going to need taxes, but the purpose of the taxes is not to pay for the war. The purpose of the taxes is to release resources. And we have to think about who we're going to impose the taxes on. We can't just put them on rich people. The reason is because we need a broad-based reduction of consumption across the majority of the population. They're all going to have to reduce consumption, not just the rich people. Remember, we don't need the rich people's money. We need them to reduce consumption. But we also need the working classes to reduce consumption. So we need a broad-based tax to reduce consumption. The problem with the tax is that it is a permanent reduction. The income that you lose to taxes is lost forever. So it's a permanent burden on people. So the working class is already making huge sacrifices for the war. They're sending their sons and daughters off to fight. Their houses are being bombed. And we can't ask them to make a permanent sacrifice. We need to ask them to make a temporary sacrifice. So what we want to do is postpone consumption. We don't want to permanently take away income. We want to give it back to them. So what we will do is postpone consumption, and effectively, he argued, we'll give them savings bonds that they can use at the end of the war by postponing consumption. And that way, they can start consuming as we wind down the war effort. I mean, assuming, of course, the war will end and presuming we're going to be victorious. Then we want to release that consumption so that we can keep operating at full employment. Then he added patriotic saving. He supported that, but didn't think there would be enough of that. Rationing of some key items and wage and price controls. But he didn't put a lot of faith in those things. For him, the biggest thing was postponing consumption. So anyway, when Yave and I started looking at the Green New Deal, of course, the $93 trillion was created by conservatives who wanted to scare the population. So it's really an outlier. But even the progressives came up with very large numbers, and they're worried about how they're going to pay for it. And so they're proposing things like carbon taxes, taxing the rich people, a wealth tax so that they can pay for it. We said, that's the wrong approach. We need to look at this the same way that Keynes looked at World War II. Okay, this is a war for human survival, even more important than World War II was. Because if we don't change things very rapidly, we're not going to have any organized human life. We might have some kind of dystopia, Mad Max sort of life. There will still be some humans that survive, but we're not going to have civilization if we don't do something very quick to deal with climate change, as well as a number of other social and economic problems that I'll conclude with. And so we need to think about it the same way. The carbon tax, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, that's looking for a market solution to solve a problem that's been created by the markets. And we don't want to tax pollution, we have to eliminate pollution. So that's not the right way to go about it. A tax on rich people, well, remember what Keynes said, that doesn't reduce consumption enough. It doesn't release enough resources if we limit our taxes to the rich. We need to reduce consumption across the board. And so it makes more sense to have a tax that will hit a large proportion of the population. So we advocate a temporary surcharge on what we call our Social Security tax or payroll tax that will hit a large part of the population. But just as Keynes argued, we want this just to be a temporary reduction. We want to postpone consumption. We will then phase in more consumption later after we've got the Green New Deal in place. And then finally, we might need other kinds of interventions. Instead of a carbon tax, we need to eliminate fossil fuel production. We don't want to try to raise tax revenue by keeping fossil fuel going and bringing on climate change even more rapidly. We need to eliminate it as quickly as we can. So we propose that. Okay, now looking at the pandemic. This economic crisis is very unusual. Most economic crises occur when we have a collapse of demand. Demand falls, and then people lose their jobs. So demand has fallen, so sales go down, and so firms start laying off workers. And the solution to that is very clear. The government has to raise demand. So you want a fiscal stimulus package to raise demand. This time around, what happened was you had a severe supply side constraint. People couldn't go to work. It wasn't that demand fell. It was supply collapsed because we had stay-at-home orders, we had social isolation, we had distancing rules that made it impossible for many kinds of businesses to continue to operate. So supply collapsed. Now, of course, if people can't go to work and the employers can't afford to pay them wages, then demand goes down. So this time around, it's ironic that the policymakers use MMT as a justification for a demand side policy. For example, sending checks to every American, whether they lost their jobs or not. I got a check, too, from Uncle Sam. The problem is we can't spend it. We can't go to, no one has been to a restaurant since early March. Okay, you can't get your hair cut. My wife had to cut my hair. So you can't spend it, okay? It was the wrong solution. What we needed to do was to first deal with the health problem. The United States and also Brazil are two countries that had the worst health crisis response in the world, and we're suffering because of that. So 1/4 of all deaths have been in America, and I know Brazil is close behind us. If you look at the US, you'll see where you're going, because our response was so terrible, because they're focused on getting these checks out, which is trying to resolve a demand problem, but our problem was on the supply side. Now, what we should have done is kept people on payrolls. We should have moved them into a job guarantee program that could have helped with the coronavirus response. People are stuck in their homes. A lot of people can't get food. Elderly people, people with immune problems and so on, who literally cannot get out. And we could have used a whole army of job guarantee workers, making sandwiches, delivering them. And of course, we have to keep the workers safe. But we could have done things with the unemployed and kept everyone on a payroll and given them something useful to do to deal with the health problem. So what this pandemic has exposed is the impacts of the health part of the crisis have been very focused on low-income people, low-wealth people. Many of them continued to work, actually. They have jobs, say working in grocery stores, cleaning hospital rooms for very low pay, under very dangerous conditions. They're dying at very high rates because they're contracting the disease on the job. So it's exposed that. In the United States, it's exposed unequal access to healthcare. When people have lost their jobs, 40 million people lost their jobs, they lost their healthcare too. They are afraid even to get tested because they got to pay for that out of their pocket. They have no idea where they're going to find the money to pay for a test. And if they get sick, they have no health care to take care of them. They're afraid to go to the hospital because they can't afford the bills. So it's exposed inequality. It's exposed the low pay and the working conditions of the people who did keep working and who were getting sick. It exposed our healthcare crisis in the United States. In spite of Obamacare, we still had 25 million people with no insurance, and now that's gone up considerably. It exposed how incompetent our governments are. And this incompetence is in a sense planned because we've downsized the government. We have appointed people who have no experience or who are actually opposed to doing what their job description says they're supposed to do, such as the Environmental Protection Agency. So you have people who are absolutely opposed to protecting the environment in charge of the agency that's supposed to protect the environment. So we have planned incompetence in government that couldn't deal with this coronavirus crisis, that cannot deal with the climate crisis that we're facing, that cannot deal with the crisis of inequality that we're facing. And now, as I'm sure you all have read about what's going on in America, our problem of racism, where the cities are on fire like we have not seen since the 1960s, when we had protests over racism in the United States. That is back again. So we have this problem of racism, this problem of policing in the United States. All of these have been exposed by the pandemic. And so the future is going to require a very broad-based reform package. So the Green New Deal already was very broad-based. The Green New Deal that we were supporting, that Bernie Sanders was supporting, it was more than tackling climate change. It included tackling unemployment with the Job Guarantee Program. It included tackling inequality. It included tackling racism, sexism, providing equal opportunity to everyone. It included healthcare for all, and what we call Medicare for all in the case of the United States. So all of these things were already in the Green New Deal, and now we also have to go after the policing problem in the United States. Brazil is probably somewhat similar on that, and the growing threat of pandemics, which this is probably just the first one. The scientists have been predicting that this would happen, with very accurate predictions. Even the numbers of deaths, it turns out some of them had predicted this very precisely. So this is the first major one, but we almost certainly are going to have more. So we have to rethink how we deal with the health part of this, but also how we deal with the economic impacts when these things do hit. So the neoliberal economy that we've been living in has created these international supply chains. I'm just giving one example of something that needs to be rethought. So the advantage to the mega corporations was they could defeat domestic labor movements. So that is why you wanted international supply chains. Find the cheapest labor in the world. And if they get unruly, quickly move operations to an even cheaper place. And so we've got these products that are produced all over the world by the cheapest labor that the firms can find. And that means that domestically our wages are depressed. We're losing jobs to foreign workers. But also it means when there's a disruption somewhere in the world, it affects all of us, including in the production of the drugs, the tests for the virus, and possibly the vaccines, if those ever come along. So we need to rethink this and focus more on diversification, on national policy. We can't rely on mega corporations to do all the planning for us. Governments have to be involved in planning and and developing the capacity to deal with these very big issues. Our governments don't have the capacity right now to do it, to deal with inequality, with racism, with climate change, and with probably more pandemics. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think now we will get some questions, and I don't have questions for the audience, from the audience right now, but I do have one question. So my first question would be that you have mentioned during your talk that governments, they don't face budget constraint, but that the market and the bond vigilantes, they say that all the time, that governments have budget constraint, and that we have to very carefully look at the ratio of debt and GDP. And so one very direct question. So this warning about budget constraint and deficits and the increased ratio of debt, who is interested in that? Because apparently for most part of the population that ignores how the system really works, it's not interesting, because it put a lot of pressure on the state and on the supply of public services like health and education and so on. So there is probably one part of society that is interested on that. So I'd like you to develop a bit more on that. And another thing that I was going to ask, and I think that somehow you mentioned that at the end of your presentation, is about the new plans, what we have to do in the future, because you in the US, you have worked, you've mentioned that, in the Green New Deal project that was far beyond green, it was not only focused on climate change and things like that, it was broadened than that. But I think now with this pandemic, we really have to worry about the broad spectrum of issues that we have. And I'm not sure if you have been following that, but as far as I could notice, in Europe, and apparently Germany is kind of pushing that. They have a very big project to kind of the reconstruction of the economy, focused on the health system and how you have to improve the capacities of these economies and societies to deal with health conditions. So maybe if we can think about some main paths in the future in order to recover the economies, this climate change worry and the possibilities that are opened to reconstruct the economy based on that, and also focusing on health issues. So those would be my first two questions.
Yes, it's really funny how Japan can run a rising debt ratio, 100%, 200%. They're going to hit 250% of GDP. And the two predictions that you will get from orthodox economists are that a debt ratio above 100% virtually guarantees high inflation. And the second is that you're going to have to pay ever higher interest rates to satisfy the bond vigilantes, or they will continue to take bonds. So Japan exceeded that by, I don't know, 1990. We've been going for 20 years with Japan increasing the debt ratio steadily, nearly zero interest rates, and zero inflation for 20 years. And so when you press and say, yeah, but eventually it's going to happen, you know, at some point, they've got to completely lose credibility. It's not going to happen. Why is the interest rate near zero? Because the Bank of Japan targets zero. Okay, it's simple. Why is Brazil's interest rate high with a debt ratio much lower? Because the central bank targets a higher interest rate. And I know that you have brought yours down. And it's the central bank that did it. It has nothing to do with bond vigilantes. The central bank can target zero in Brazil too. So it's very clear the doomsayers are just plain wrong. It doesn't happen. Now, the United States debt ratio has been increasing since the 1780s. It's just gone up steadily at a pace of about 2% per year. So our debt ratio rises every year on average by about 2%. Okay. If that continues for the next 5,000 years, our debt ratio is going to be really high. Can it continue? Yes, it can continue. Now, the deficits are really not discretionary. In other words, governments don't choose their deficit. Governments budget. Okay, and so they say, we're going to spend $3 trillion this year, and here are the programs we're going to spend the money on. Now, some of the programs are contingent, like unemployment compensation. There's a continuing resolution that says, if people meet these conditions, they get to collect their unemployment compensation. So that one is open-ended, depending on how many people lose their jobs. But anyway, we have a budget law, and that indicates more or less how much we're going to spend. Then we have a tax law. And the tax law will be something like, if your income is between $10,000 and $20,000 a year, you're going to pay 10%, but you get some exemptions. So it works out to be, the government's going to take a bit less than 10% of your income. So we have a tax law. These are two separate laws, okay? And both of them are uncertain. So we begin our year on July 1st. On July 1st, you can make a projection of what you think the government spending will be and what you think the tax revenue will be over the course of the year. And you're almost always going to be wildly wrong. The reason you're going to be wrong is because both of these, the government spending and the taxing, depends on what happens in the economy over the course of the year. President Clinton went on television in the United States in 1999. We had just started running a surplus. It was our first budget surplus since 1929, which is a momentous year because we went into the Great Depression the next year. So we ran a surplus in 1929. We didn't run any surpluses that lasted more than a quarter or two until 1999. And Clinton's economic advisors, this Council of Economic Advisors, projected the surpluses would run for 15 years. This was their best guess, okay? 15 years. And we were going to retire all the government debt. And by the end of the 15-year period, there would be no more government debt. Okay, what happened? The dot-com bubble burst. We went into recession. we got a budget deficit. And we've had a budget deficit every year since. So every one of those 15 years that they projected a surplus for turned out to have a deficit every single year. Okay, so you can't control this. It depends on the performance of the economy. When you go into a recession, government spending on some things goes up, like unemployment compensation, welfare if you have a welfare program, and your tax revenue collapses because people lose their jobs or their income is cut. And so you end up with a budget deficit. Now, there's this approach developed by Wynne Godley, and MMT uses this. It's called the sectoral balance approach. And I'll try to keep it really simple. If we divide the economy up into three sectors, we have a domestic private sector, that's households and firms. We have a government sector, that's all levels of government, but it's dominated by your national government. And we have a foreign sector, which is the rest of the world. The sum of those balances has to be zero. So each one of those sectors could run a surplus or it could run a deficit. A surplus means they spend less than their income. A deficit means they spend more than their income. Any individual sector can run either a surplus or a deficit. But if we add them up, the sectors that run surpluses have to be offset by sectors that run deficits because they have to sum to zero. And in the case of the United States, and it happens to be true, all the English-speaking nations, the government sector runs a deficit, the private sector runs a surplus, and the rest of the world runs a surplus against us. Okay, so our government's deficit has to be big enough to let our private sector run a surplus, which is what we normally call savings. They save, which makes sense that normally you expect households to spend less than their income. Okay, it's safer. And firms can go either way, but generally speaking, in the developed capitalist countries, investment is not by firms. Investment isn't financed by enough borrowing to cause the private sector to be in deficit, usually. And then finally, the rest of the world runs a surplus, which means that we buy more from the rest of the world than they buy from us, okay? So the budget deficit at the aggregate level depends on the outcome of these other sectors. And those cannot be controlled by policy. So when you're setting a budget, whether you're going to end up with a deficit at the end of the year depends on what happens to those other two balances. And you can't control them, okay? So that's a bit long. Let me move on to the, well, is there any magic number? And the answer is clearly no, there's no magic number of what is a problem. As I said earlier, your problem is resources. Your problem is not running out of money. Can Japan always spend more than the tax revenue? Yes, it can. Can it always service the debt, even if the debt ratio is 250% of GDP? Yes, it can. And by keeping the interest rate low, it actually keeps interest spending low. I haven't looked at the Japanese data that closely, but in the case of the United States, even though our debt ratio is going up, the debt service, which is government spending on interest, is actually not going up. And the reason is because the interest rate's low. So if you keep the interest rate low, spending on interest doesn't need to rise, even though the debt ratio rises. Okay, the new, yes, what progressives have to do is to demand that we take advantage of the crisis. to push through progressive policies. And you know what the conservatives are going to do. They're going to say, look, you're using this crisis as an excuse to get all of the goodies you progressives want, like a job guarantee, like healthcare for all, like reducing inequality and racism. But if you notice what the conservatives are doing, they're all taking advantage of the crisis to push through their own agenda. So Naomi Klein, quite a while ago, had a book, Shock Doctrine, where she explained this: the conservatives always make their advances in crises. They always get their wish list in a crisis. They say, because of the crisis, for example, Hurricane Katrina, when it hit New Orleans, the conservatives turned New Orleans into the neoliberal dream. They privatized everything. And they used the excuse of the hurricane to do that. And so the conservatives are already doing this. They're already using the crisis as an excuse for more deregulation, for freeing the private sector more, supposedly so they can, create vaccines for us and all of that. Our administration said, well, of course we want the developers of the vaccine to get rich off their innovation. So of course we want them to be profitable. Well, why? Why should they profit off a pandemic? This is something that the government ought to take control over. Keep the vaccine cheap, make sure everyone gets it. This is, it's in a way, it's a small example of what I'm talking about. The government being more involved and ensuring that you don't have individuals who are reaping all the benefits of this crisis. What we want to do is make sure that whatever response we have, everybody has access to it. If it's drugs that help treat the disease, or if it's vaccines, these need to be extremely cheap, not something that a few individuals can make billions of dollars off. And dealing with all the other problems we've got, the climate change, the chronic unemployment, the chronic pay too low wages in all the developed and developing world, because the big firms are able to move operations to the cheapest wages in the world. So we need to have a response to ensure that that doesn't happen. Let me stop and see if you have other questions.
Yes, I have one more specific question. Someone from the audience asked me to ask you, how do you assess the Fed policy of buying private bonds? And because we have this in Brazil as well, our central bank also proposing something similar. So it would be interesting for us to have your thoughts on that.
Well, in the global financial crisis, a lot of the main central banks had some form of quantitative easing, where they would buy government bonds, but also private bonds, like mortgage-backed securities. We never really supported this. The buying government bonds essentially exchanges bonds that earn interest in bank portfolios for reserves that earn much lower interest, which never made any sense. Why are you trying to reduce bank earnings when we have a bank crisis? So we never thought that made much sense. The you could help banks if you bought bad assets from the banks. So if you're buying bad corporate bonds, bad mortgage-backed securities that have high default risk, that will help the banks. They get to push the trashy assets off to the central bank. That's not a good policy. You should deal with non-performing loans, risky bonds in a different way. You should choose. Okay, you've got a corporation, their bonds aren't any good, they can't make payments on it. You have to decide, do you really want to bail them out? Is it in the national interest to do that? And if it is, you should do it directly. And this would be more of a treasury operation than a central bank. Treasuries are responsible for taking over insolvent banks and insolvent non-financial corporations. And that involves covering the negative net worth of those institutions. And I wouldn't say I'm always against it, but I'm usually against it. Because if you, now I'm only talking about the US because I don't know the case in Brazil. If you look at US corporations, financial and non-financial corporations, coronavirus hits in America and we start shutting down operations where it was dangerous. And within a week, these corporations were in trouble. That tells you what their reserves were like. It tells you, what their finances were like. They couldn't get through a week without running to Congress saying, please bail us out. Now, we had gone through a 10-year recovery. Reported profits over those 10 years were extremely high, and the corporations were not investing. Okay, so they have huge profit flows. They're not investing, and they can only last 1 week of a downturn. What on earth were they doing? Okay, well, we know what they were doing. They're buying back their own stocks in order to boost the income of all of their top CEOs and managers that they had given stock options to. Okay, they not only spent all of their profits buying their own stocks, they borrowed to buy stocks. And it was strictly to boost stock prices so the top management could get huge capital gains, millions and billions, and so they couldn't last 1 week of bad times. So what would be the proper response? I think let them go bankrupt. Let them fail. Now, if they have a business model that will be profitable, someone will buy them, okay, cheaply. They'll buy them on the cheap. And when the coronavirus passes, or at least, we can go back to work, they'll start operating again. So let them fail. Let the stockholders fail. Because this was a very poorly run corporation. And that would be true of all the big ones. They're very poorly run. They should learn a lesson from this. They can go after their CEOs for mismanaging the corporations, but yeah, I think that they should just fail. I don't think you should be buying their bad bonds. Now, we have lots of small businesses in America that weren't doing any of this kind of stuff. And we're giving loans and grants to small business. I'm not opposed to that, okay? Through no fault of their own, the restaurants had to shut their doors. The hair salons had to shut their doors. Yeah, we should help them. The airlines, no, let them fail. Let them go bankrupt. The planes will still be there. The airports are still there. Someone's going to buy them. And when we can start flying again, they'll start flying. I don't think we should be bailing out United Airlines. Let them fail. Let them go bankrupt. Let the stockholders lose. Now, there will be ramifications from that because our pension funds are heavily invested in stocks. And so we've got to decide whether we should bail out the pension funds. I would rather bail out the workers who worked hard all their lives and they're counting on that pension. I would rather bail them out. Don't bail out United Airlines, but bail out the workers that hold stocks in United Airlines. So I think we do need bailouts, but we ought to look at who we're bailing out. We shouldn't reward a decade of bad behavior.
I think I have now a couple of questions. I will try to make them kind of together. Two sets of questions, in fact. One question is more like specific, or a group of questions more specific about the job guarantee. If you could explain a bit more, what is the job guarantee policy proposals? And someone from the audience asked me to ask you about apparently it was a last paper written by Pavlina Cherneva that is at the Levy Institute website, and she apparently makes a differentiation between the job guarantee and the employee of last resort program. This person asked me to develop a bit more on that, if you are aware of that. Okay, so this is one set of questions. Another set of questions are about a more, let's say, political topic, because we were following here the primaries in the US, like pretty more before the pandemic. And we were, most of us, fans of the leftist candidate. But now we have another situation, and we know that you were close to the, and Alessandra Ocasio-Cortez was also close to the leftist candidate, but now he is not on the run anymore. And so our question would be, what are the chances for an MMT really progressive perspective for the next years in the US, with Joe Biden's being the candidate? And because this is important also for us, because that sets a kind of a standard in politics, and something that can spread out around the world. So that would be very important, to kind of follow what is happening in politics in the US about that. Okay.
The job guarantee. I learned about employer of last resort from Hyman Minsky when I was his student. And it's in his famous 1986 book, Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. So I was familiar with it and thought it was a good idea. At the time, employer of last resort terminology, Minsky said it was common during the Depression, during the New Deal. And at various points in time, it would come back. Minsky worked on it in the 1960s. I really did not know how much he had done on employer of last resort in the 60s. It turned out he had written a lot. He was at Berkeley, and they had a very good labor department that was institutionalist, and they were formulating an alternative to the Kennedy President Johnson war on poverty. that finally was passed in 1965. Kennedy, of course, was killed in 63. So Johnson put it into place, and Minsky and his team formulated an alternative, said the war on poverty is going to fail because it's missing the most important component of a war on poverty, which is jobs. Minsky said, if jobs is not the centerpiece of your war on poverty, you will never reduce the poverty rate. Now, it turned out he was right. The war on poverty never reduced the poverty rate. Now, that doesn't mean that it didn't do some good things, but it never reduced the poverty rate. He argued that you need employer of last resort. And he in these writings in the 60s and in the early 70s, he wrote as much on this during that period as he did on financial instability, which is what he's very famous for. People didn't know or had forgotten that he'd written so much on employment and poverty. So his idea was that the government takes workers as they are, where they are, and creates a job they can do that provides social function. And he modeled it on our New Deal programs, especially the WPA, which was Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration that took workers and basically built the U.S. infrastructure. And even Americans don't know enough about this. The U.S. was not a developed country in 1930. We were an underdeveloped country. We had large portions of America did not have electricity. They didn't have indoor plumbing. They didn't have running water. They didn't have decent schools. They didn't have airports. They didn't have paved roads. So that is what the WPA did. They built thousands of airports, tens of thousands of schools, libraries. They electrified basically the South. And they played a huge role in preparing the U.S. for World War II. We wouldn't have been ready for World War II. It was the WPA and the other jobs programs that did that. So Minsky modeled his on that the workers would do things like that. Now, in addition, the New Deal jobs programs hired artists, they hired musicians, they gave tens of thousands of performances all over America. They documented culture that, of course, was rapidly changing. So we documented the culture of the 30s. So lots of stuff like that, too. And Minsky would have done the same thing with his employer of last resort. He also went through how it helps to stabilize the economy, how you can use it to bring up wages at the bottom, so you can use it to reduce inequality. So it's more than just let's do useful things and let's give people a job. It was part of a whole reform of what economists call a labor market, although it's nothing like a market, really, but to bring up wages and reduce inequality, provide training on the job, and all of that kind of stuff. So as we developed MMT, we also refined our proposal based on what we knew about Minsky. And it turned out our proposal was very similar to his. We didn't know all the details because I didn't know about all these publications until after he died. But our proposal was very similar. So it has a uniform wage. And you use that wage to provide a wage floor for the whole economy. So for example, our proposal now is the wage would be $15 an hour, which is about double our minimum wage. So this would immediately ensure all wages go to at least 15 because no one's going to work for a private firm if they can get $15 an hour in the job guarantee program. So you immediately will boost the wages. And whatever benefits you give in the program will become universal too. So if you get healthcare in this program, private employers are going to have to provide healthcare, or better, get their elected representatives to enact a universal healthcare program for the United States, which is what we would prefer to do. The one thing we did differently from Minsky, and Pavlina's worked a lot on all of this, is we would decentralize the administration of the program. Minsky in the 80s, when we would talk about unemployment and welfare, and he would bring up the New Deal jobs programs, he would say, you know, I'm not sure that we have a government anymore in Washington that is competent enough to run a program like this. So Roosevelt could do it, but remember, we had Reagan. So this was during the Reagan years. I don't think we've got a government competent to do this, or that, you know, really wants to do it. And so we took that seriously. We said, you know, we don't believe, by then we had Bush Jr. The Bush administration isn't going to be able to do this. I mean, look what they did with Katrina. They allowed thousands of people to die in New Orleans because of incompetence. They put a guy who, I think he worked in horse racing, in charge of our emergency response administration, FEMA, in the United States. A guy who knew something about horses is going to run the response in New Orleans to the hurricane. So we decentralized it. The federal government provides the funding, but the program is decentralized. We also changed the name because employer of last resort sounds derogatory. Oh, you work in this program, this is the last resort. That means, you know, nobody else wanted you, and this is the last resort program for people who failed at everything they've tried to do. So we didn't want to call it employer of last resort. So we actually were calling it public service employment, PSE. Bill Mitchell was doing the same thing in Australia, and he was calling it BSE, buffer stock employment, because he thought of the job guarantee program as like a price support program, which we typically have in agriculture. And Bill had studied agricultural economics. So he was calling it BSE. And in the end, we said, let's compromise and call it job guarantee. And so we've been calling it the job guarantee since then. So I haven't read the paper that you're referring to, but maybe this is what she's getting at. We don't want anyone to feel like this is the last resort. Okay, I'll do the politics. So the pandemic was, I think, sort of the final nail in the coffin for the Bernie Sanders campaign, because he had not done as well as he needed to do in the South with African Americans. And with the pandemic, suddenly everybody's scared. And it's obvious the Trump administration was incompetent to deal with the problems. And poll after poll after poll showed what people wanted to do was to run the Democratic candidate with the best chance of beating Trump. And the media helped play this up, continually claiming that Bernie wouldn't beat Trump, but Biden would. And so even though I think the majority of Democrats, if they could choose the candidate that had the views that aligned with theirs, it would have been Bernie. but they bought this line that Bernie can't beat Trump, but Biden can. Now, I think that was completely wrong. I think Biden is a weak candidate. But it is possible that the pandemic response and the response to the police killing Black Americans, which I think is even bigger, a bigger mark against Trump than the pandemic was, Biden may well win this. Regarding Biden and MMT, Biden, before the pandemic, you never saw anything from Biden that would make you hopeful at all. He opposed Medicare for all. He's always worried about deficits, and he's also much more war hawk for my tastes. However, Stephanie Kelton, who was Bernie's economic advisor, is now an advisor for Biden. And Biden has been meeting with Bernie, and it's possible that it will be better than I feared. I think my position is very similar to what AOC has said, that yes, she's going to vote for him. Yes, she's going to support him against Trump, but she's not endorsing him. And I think there are too many things in Biden's past that, and just projecting in the future, that I'm not enthusiastic at all about him, which is bad news, because I'm worried that with either Trump or Biden, we're not going to make substantial progress in the next 4 years. And if the scientists are right, we're down to about 10 years for dealing with climate change. And now we see all the social manifestations of other problems that we have in addition to climate change. 4 years is a long time to wait to get started with all the reforms that we have to do. We'll have only 6 years left then. So that's a real problem. And it's very unfortunate. This is either Trump or Biden. Neither of them are up to the task.
Okay. I think we have one question that I probably know what you're going to talk about, but that's important because for many people that's what come to mind. And the question is about being the Brazilian currency, real, sovereign currency, because we have this kind of debate here. For some it's clear, for others what mean sovereign currency. You talked about that in the beginning of your talk, but I think that this is a very important point. So if you could talk a bit more on that, that would be helpful.
Okay, I know it always comes up, especially in Latin American countries, the balance of payment constraint. And so the great fear, I understand it's a worry that if you took advantage of the fiscal policy space that you have, because Brazil has the fiscal policy space and monetary, so you could choose zero interest rates if you want to. You could choose to spend more and tax less if you want to. You have your own currency. So you can definitely do this. The fear is that if you grow faster, you're going to import more than you export. And your trade deficit will grow, and that will threaten the value of the currency. Okay, so that's a quick summary of what the fear is. And I won't say that that's impossible. It could happen. Okay. But the balance of payment constraint is self-imposed. Okay. You could do this. You can grow faster, and you can run a current account deficit, and you can run a growing current account deficit. That's what the United States does. That's what Australia does. We choose not to impose a balance of payment constraint. We let our balance of payment go more negative. Okay, Brazil could too. And it doesn't affect the US exchange rate. We've run a current account deficit since Ronald Reagan. Anytime that our growth rate goes up, our our current account deficit increases. And if we grow at a robust pace, it's going to reach 8% of GDP. So current account deficit, 8% of GDP. When we slow down, it can fall to 3%. So it's in that range, 3 to 8%. No impact on the exchange. Of course, now the response will be, but you're special. You issue the dollar, okay? And yes, the dollar is the main international reserve currency. It will remain the main international currency probably for the rest of my life, and maybe well beyond that. So people say that eventually a currency will replace it, and yeah, that's probably true. Someday. It's going to take a lot longer than people think. The British currency was the main international reserve currency for a very long time after the US became much bigger than they were and much more important as an economy than Britain was. So there's a legacy that allowed the pound to be dominant for a long time. And I think there will be a legacy of the dollar for a long time. China's already surpassed us in terms of size. But China's not even close to issuing an important international reserve currency. I won't go into why I say that, but they're not. So we don't see any on the horizon. So this is true. And if you say, take Australia. Australia's a tiny country, okay? And they run current account deficits too, just like we do, consistently. And when they grow faster, it increases. And sometimes there are impacts on their exchange rate. Their exchange rate does fluctuate. They let it float. They choose not to impose a balance of payment constraint. They go ahead and let their current account deficit grow. Australian dollars flow out into global portfolios. And occasionally, their exchange rate falls significantly. I don't know, 25, 40% fluctuation of the exchange rate. I've been in Australia when the Australian dollar was really high and when it was really low. They deal with it. So when the exchange rate falls and imports become expensive, and potentially there would be big negative economic impacts at home, what the Australian government does is it uses its position as a sovereign currency issuer to spend more. And so if unemployment starts to rise, the Australian government will put in place jobs programs, hire people. They'll build trails along the ocean. So I've seen those, I've walked on them, beautiful trails. They'll put people to work. So they allow the balance of payments to move against them, but then they create jobs domestically. and keep people employed. And so Brazil could choose to do that. You could choose to let your exchange rate move and let your balance of payments move, in favor, we say in favor of the exporters to Brazil. And it could hurt your own domestic employers, but the government could provide jobs to keep those people employed as your domestic firms have trouble, and deal with it that way, and use your domestic policy space to offset any negative consequences of fluctuations of the exchange rate. It's a policy choice. I wouldn't say that no country in the world should just adopt that strategy. For countries that are much earlier in their stage of development, having a relatively stable exchange rate could be a big advantage, making it easier to plan for development and plan to try to build up your export sector. You may want a more stable exchange rate, but Brazil isn't a poor little developing country. It's a very rich country that chooses to live below its means, right? You keep huge parts of your population unemployed, you operate below capacity, you live way below your means because you're worried about your exchange rate. And so I think the trade-off in the case of Brazil is not worth it. You would be much better off to go ahead and let the balance of payments do what it does, let the exchange rate do what it does, and keep your population fully employed with a rising living standard. I think that would be a better policy than trying to keep your exchange rate up with very high interest rates that cripple your domestic sector. And, I said before at one of the talks in Brazil, when I was a kid in school, in the late 50s, early 60s, we were always taught that Brazil was the country that was going to challenge the US. Brazil was going to become the biggest economy in the world. No one ever talked about China. No, it was Brazil. Brazil was our big competitor. And here I am, 60 years later, still waiting. Brazil's not there. Okay? And I think that some of it is because not taking advantage of the policy space that you've got. So that's probably enough on
that. Okay, thank you so much. I think that your whole presentation and this debate was very, very helpful, but especially your final remarks about Brazil and Brazil choosing to live under, what we could do, and choosing the wrong policies because we are afraid of everything, afraid of the exchange rate changes and the potential impacts on inflationary rate, because we are afraid of deficits and everything. So we should be afraid of being afraid, because that's the main point. So thank you again. Thank you very much for your time, for spending this time with us. And that's it. I think we are ready to finish. Então, eu gostaria também de agradecer a todos que estiveram aqui conosco, pelas perguntas que foram enviadas. Acho que foi um privilégio ter o professor Randall Wray aqui conosco. E, enfim, né, eu quero agradecer aqui em nome do grupo de estudos Neoliberalismo, Subjetivação e Resistências, por todos aqueles que, enfim, né, estão aqui conosco prestigiando esse evento, que eu acho que foi muito importante. Obrigada e boa tarde.